That's not what happened. 6 words. Spoken low, almost apologetic, from the front seat of a car that cost more than most houses on most streets in most towns. Nobody was supposed to correct Elena Voss's board members. Nobody in that car at that hour driving down a rain-slicked Park Avenue with the streetlights doubling themselves in the black glass, nobody was supposed to say anything at all. Wait, what did he just say? The 2 directors in the backseat had been laughing about an old scandal, the kind of laughter people use to cover the fact that the story still stings. 8 years ago, an investigative piece had gutted Voss Media's stock price in a single news cycle, and one of the directors, a silver-templed man named Marsh, who'd had 2 martinis at the airport before the flight, was getting a key detail wrong, confidently wrong, the kind of wrong that gets repeated at enough dinner parties that people start believing it's history. The second source wasn't internal, Julian Kane said, eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel. It came from a former employee at the Chicago branch. Silence. The particular expensive silence of people who are used to being the smartest ones in any room they enter. Elena looked up from her phone. Her driver hired 11 weeks ago through an agency, a man with a folder-thin employment history and a voice too calm for his job title, had just corrected a member of her own board on a story that had nearly ended her father's company. She caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. He didn't hold the look. He never did. "You read that closely?" she asked, and there was an edge in it, the particular mockery of someone who has spent a career keeping people in their lane. "I know the man who wrote it," Julian said, and left it there. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Something about his stillness bothered her more than his correction had. In 11 weeks, she'd never once seen him rattled, not by traffic, not by her assistant screaming into a phone in the back seat, not by the 2 Rottweilers a hedge fund client insisted on bringing along last month. There was a pen clipped to his shirt pocket, the cheap kind, the kind newspaper people used to carry before everyone switched to typing everything into a phone. She'd noticed it before. She noticed it again now. "Fine," Elena said, and smiled the smile she used in boardrooms, warm on the surface, cold 2 inches under. "Come to the 15th anniversary dinner tonight. Tell us all what the great reporter really thinks." She let the word "great" curdle a little on her tongue. "Don't worry about what to wear. There's a seat for the help, too. End of the table." It was the kind of invitation designed to be declined, a door held open only far enough to prove someone doesn't belong walking through it. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't argue either. "I'll be there," he said, and adjusted the rearview mirror a half-inch the way he always did whenever the laughter in the back seat got too loud. A habit. The kind you build when you've spent years learning to notice who's watching you and from where. Her phone buzzed against her palm. A text from Gregory Hale, the longest-serving man on her board. "Don't let old business distract you tonight." She didn't know yet why her hand tightened around the phone case. She only knew that it did. On the radio, a newscaster's voice cut in something about a court filing downtown, and Julian reached over and switched the station before the sentence finished. Elena noticed. She always noticed things like that, the small tells people didn't know they were giving away, and she filed it in the part of her mind where she kept everything she wasn't ready to look at directly. Behind her, someone mentioned her father's name. Arthur would have loved this old thing coming back up. And Elena's gaze slid to the window instead of the mirror. She didn't do that. Elena Voss looked people in the eye. Elena Voss did not look away. Except apparently when the subject was her father. The car slowed outside the Modern, its windows glowing gold against the wet dark. The Museum of Modern Art rising behind it like something out of a postcard nobody sends anymore. Julian pulled to the curb and put the car in park. For 1 second, just one, his hand paused on the gear shift and something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like grief. Then it was gone. He came around and opened her door like it was any other Tuesday. Elena stepped out into the cold, smoothing her coat, already composing the mocking little introduction she'd give at the head of the table. She had no idea, not yet, that the man opening car doors for a living had once made her father's whole empire shake with nothing but a notebook and 11 months of digging. She was about to find out. And so was everyone else in that private dining room. What happens when the woman doing the mocking finds out exactly who she's mocking? Stay close, because in about 90 seconds a glass is going to shatter, and nothing after that will sound the same. The private room at the Modern looked out over a sculpture garden, lit up gold for the occasion, and Elena stood at the head of a table crowded with 15 years of Voss media leadership, champagne already going around twice. "Everyone," she said, gesturing toward the doorway with the flourish of someone presenting a party trick. "My special guest tonight." Julian stood there in a plain gray suit that didn't try to be anything it wasn't. A few people laughed, not cruelly, just the easy laugh of people who assume the joke is safe. Somebody made a comment about the open bar being wasted on a man who probably drinks Bud Light in the break room, and nobody at that table corrected them. Nobody at that table thought the man standing in the doorway mattered enough to be dangerous. A waiter pulled out a chair for him at the far end past the flower arrangements, past the seating chart with its careful hierarchy of names. Julian sat without complaint. He folded his napkin the way a man folds a napkin when he's spent years learning not to take up more space than he's given. Then Helen Drayton looked up. She was 68 years old, retired now. Invited only because she'd run the company's editorial arm for 2 decades before anyone at that table had learned to spell quarterly earnings. Her wine glass slipped from her fingers and hit the floor, and the sound of it breaking cut through the room like something physical. "Julian Kane," she said, and her voice had gone strange, thin, like she was looking at a ghost that had gained 40 pounds of ordinary life since she'd last seen it. "It can't be." Elena stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "You know my driver?" Helen's answer was quiet, but the whole table heard it anyway. He was one of the sharpest investigative reporters this city ever had. That series on Voss Media 8 years ago, the one that took the stock down 40% in a week, that was him. The room went cold in the particular way rooms go cold when everyone realizes they've been standing next to something they didn't understand. A few board members looked at Julian like he'd smuggled in a weapon. Maybe in a sense he had. Gregory Hale, seated 2 chairs down from Elena, set his fork down very carefully, the way a man sets something down when his hand isn't quite steady enough to trust with it. "That was 8 years ago," Gregory said, too quickly to no one in particular. Elena walked out into the hallway, and Julian followed, without being asked, the way a man follows when he already knows what's coming. "You planned this," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, controlled, the same voice she used to end negotiations she'd already decided to lose. "I never once requested to be assigned to your car," Julian said, short. No pleading in it, no scrambling to explain, just the plain fact laid down like a stone. She fired him from the dinner in front of everyone, told him loud enough for the whole hallway that his services were no longer required, tonight or any other night, and watched him walk out through the lobby without once looking back to see if she was watching. Elena's fury was never really about the hallway or the seating chart or even an 8-year-old headline. It was about the one thing she could not survive control slipping out of her hands in front of the very people who'd watched her father build the company in the first place. Underneath that flat-level voice was a much younger woman who had learned early that composure was the one inheritance nobody could ever take from her. And firing Julian on the spot, however unfair, was the fastest way to feel like she still owned the room. Somewhere between that hallway and her apartment that night, the story she thought she knew started coming apart in her hands. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen counter at 11 p.m., with her laptop open, logging into the car service's vendor portal, the kind of back-end access a client the size of Voss Media had long ago written into its contract, and pulling up the assignment records for that week. The system was automated. No human hand had picked Julian Kane for her car. It really had been random, which meant the man she'd humiliated in front of her entire leadership team hadn't engineered a single second of it. That should have settled something. Instead, it opened a door she hadn't known was there. By 1 a.m, she'd found the old articles, his old articles, cached and yellowed with age on the internet the way old news always is. She read all 11 months of his reporting on her father's company, waiting for the accusation, the smoking gun, the sentence where he'd called Arthur Voss a liar. It never came. He'd asked questions, sharp ones. Ones the company had never actually answered, that was all. She read until 3 in the morning, and by the time she closed the laptop, she wasn't angry at him anymore. She was angry at herself for not asking the same questions 8 years sooner. The next evening, against every instinct that had built her career, Elena drove herself to Astoria, Queens, a small 2-bedroom walk-up above a bakery that still used the same hand-lettered sign it must have had since the Reagan administration. A little girl answered the door before Julian could get to it. 10 years old, blonde, gap-toothed, homework spread across the kitchen table, in the kind of cheerful chaos that never once existed in Elena's own childhood home. A chipped ceramic mug sat by the sink, hand-painted, clearly made by small fingers, in some long-ago art class, and Elena found herself staring at it a beat too long. The way you stare at things that belong to a life you didn't know you were missing. "Sophie," Julian said, "go finish your math." Sophie looked at Elena with open curiosity, the unguarded kind only children still have, and went back to the table without a word of complaint. The apartment smelled like something simmering on the stove. A porch light buzzed faintly outside the window. It was, in every way, the opposite of Elena's world. Small, warm, a little worn at the edges, and entirely unashamed of it. Elena asked the question she'd been afraid of since the moment Helen's glass hit the floor. Her voice shook just slightly on the way out. "Do you believe my father did something wrong?" Julian didn't answer quickly. He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in years, not around her, not through her, but directly at the parts she usually kept hidden. "I believe he knew more than he ever said." It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than one. It was a door left standing open. And Elena would spend the entire night walking back and forth in front of it, unable to make herself either close it or walk through. What was Arthur Voss hiding, and how far was he willing to go to keep it buried? The answer is waiting in a place Elena hasn't opened in years. Elena fired a man in front of his entire industry over a story he never even printed. The worst of. Team Elena, she had every right to protect herself from a stranger with a hidden past. Team Julian, he did nothing but tell the truth and paid for it twice. Comment Elena or Julian below. At 2 in the morning, Elena Voss let herself into the sub-basement archive of the Voss Media Building with a set of keys almost nobody else still carried. The building was silent, the way only office towers get silent. Not peaceful, just empty. The hum of the HVAC system, the only thing keeping her company as the elevator doors sighed shut behind her. She hadn't told her assistant where she was going. She hadn't told anyone. Some things, she was beginning to understand, a person has to do alone, in the dark, without an audience to perform for. She hadn't been down here since she was 22 years old, filing boxes for her father one bored summer, and she still remembered exactly which shelf held the year everything nearly fell apart. Back then, her father used to come down at lunch sometimes, roll up his sleeves and help her sort through the older files, just to have an excuse to talk to her. He'd told her once, only half joking, that a company's real history wasn't in the annual reports. It was down here, in the boxes nobody wanted to open. She hadn't understood what he meant. Standing in that same aisle now, 16 years later, in heels she'd already kicked off, she understood it completely. The boxes from 2017 had gone soft and yellow at the corners, the cardboard sighing under her hands like it, too, was tired of keeping secrets. She sat down right there on the concrete floor, heels off stockinged feet, cold against the ground, and started pulling folders, one at a time, under the buzzing fluorescent light. Halfway through the third box, her fingers stopped on a folder that had been shoved to the very back, behind old expense reports nobody would ever have reason to reread. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. She would have known that handwriting anywhere, the particular slant of the capital A, the way the tails of his Y's dragged a little too far left. Her father's hand, Arthur Voss's hand. This is the moment the whole story turns. Keep listening, because what Elena found in that folder didn't just change what she knew, it changed who she thought she was. The memo was dated March of 2017, addressed to no one, the kind of document a man writes only for himself, to keep himself honest about something he's about to bury. Elena read it twice before her mind would let the words sit still long enough to mean anything. Her father had discovered that Gregory Hale, already a board member for over a decade by then, and running the company's strategy division on the side, the way founders' old friends sometimes wore two hats at once, had been selling proprietary information to a rival firm. Quietly. Steadily. In exchange for a private stake worth more than his salary would have paid him in a decade. Arthur had found the paper trail himself late one night in this very building. She read it a third time, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something easier to carry. They didn't. Her father's own hand had written the date, the initials, the careful bookkeeping of a man who believed that even the things he chose to hide deserved to be recorded honestly, at least for himself, at least on paper. No one else would ever see. And Arthur Voss had said nothing. Not because he didn't understand what it meant. The memo made that plain enough. If this becomes public now in the middle of restructuring, we lose 400 jobs before the quarter ends. Good people, people who trusted me. Arthur had confronted Gregory privately instead, forced him to return the stake, sign a quiet settlement, disappear from the story entirely. He'd traded the truth for 400 paychecks, and then he'd carried that trade alone for the rest of his life, never telling a soul, not even his own daughter. Elena sat on that cold floor for a long time, the memo trembling faintly in her hands, though the room itself was still. Not from fear, from something closer to grief. The specific, hollow grief of losing a version of someone you loved, even while the real person is still standing right in front of you. She had spent her whole life holding her father up as something unbreakable. Arthur Voss, who never lost his temper in a meeting. Arthur Voss, who taught her that a company's word was worth more than its quarterly numbers. Arthur Voss, who she'd quoted at his own memorial service 2 years ago, standing at a podium in a black dress, telling 300 mourners that her father never once compromised. He had compromised. He compromised in the biggest, quietest way a man can, by choosing silence and calling it protection, and never once explaining the difference to the daughter who'd go on building her whole understanding of honesty around his example. What broke inside Elena on that concrete floor wasn't the discovery that her father had a secret every family carries at least one. It was the discovery that the version of him she'd built her whole identity around, the incorruptible man she'd quoted like scripture at his own funeral, had never fully existed at all. Her fear underneath the shock was old and simple. If Arthur Voss could compromise and still have been a good man, then maybe the rigid, uncompromising person she'd spent her whole career becoming wasn't honoring him. It was just armor she'd never actually needed. And then sitting there in the dust and the fluorescent hum, another thought arrived, slower and somehow harder to hold than the first. Julian had known part of this. Not all of it. The memo made clear that only Arthur and Gregory had ever known the whole truth, but Julian's old reporting had circled close enough to it that he must have sensed something buried beneath the numbers. And he had never printed the accusation, never guessed his way into a headline he couldn't fully prove. A man with less patience, less principle, would have run the story anyway and let the ambiguity work in his favor. It would have made him famous. It would have ended his career on a wave instead of a whimper. He'd chosen the harder, quieter path instead. He'd asked the honest questions and left the rest alone, and it had cost him the goodwill of an entire industry, evidently, judging by the small apartment above the bakery in Astoria. He'd traded the win for the truth of what he actually knew, which wasn't quite enough to prove, and he'd never once tried to dress it up as more than it was. Her father had chosen silence to protect people. Julian had chosen silence to protect the truth. Elena was only beginning to understand how differently those two choices could look, and how much more it had cost the second man to make his. She thought sitting there of the man she'd humiliated in a hallway 2 nights earlier, walking out through a lobby without turning around. The man she'd told in front of 15 colleagues that his services were no longer required. The same man who had once held a story in his hands that could have burned Voss Media to the ground, and had chosen instead to ask a few careful questions and walk away. For the first time since she'd taken over the company, Elena Voss felt something she wasn't used to feeling in that building. Not control. Not certainty. Something closer to respect. Real respect. The kind that has to be earned in the dark, away from cameras, where nobody is keeping score. She folded the memo carefully, the way you fold something you already know you'll need again, and placed it inside her coat pocket, close to her chest, the way a person carries the one thing they can't afford to lose on the walk home. Outside the city had gone quiet in that particular hour before the garbage trucks start their rounds. Elena stood alone on the sidewalk in front of the building her father built, her father's confession folded against her heart, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that nothing about her life was going to look the same by morning. But somewhere out past the city lights, a very different kind of move was already taking shape. One aimed straight at the man she was only just beginning to understand. Julian had been back behind the wheel of Elena's car for 3 days now. She'd called the agency herself the very next morning after their conversation in Astoria. No explanation offered, none asked for. And he'd simply shown up at 7 a.m. like nothing had happened at all. The way people do when an apology has already been understood without needing to be spoken. 2 nights after Elena found the memo, Gregory Hale was waiting in the parking garage beneath the Voss Media building when Julian came down to get his own car. The beat-up sedan he drove home to Astoria after his shifts, not the company car he'd been driving for Elena all week. The garage was nearly empty at that hour, just a handful of cars under the flickering fluorescent tubes, and the sound of Julian's own footsteps echoed back at him off the concrete before he even saw Gregory standing there. Gregory was leaning against the driver's side door like he owned it. He was holding a check in one hand and a thick envelope in the other, and his smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "Long day?" Gregory asked, conversational, like they were 2 old friends running into each other at a hardware store, instead of a man ambushing another man beside his own car at 10 o'clock at night. Julian said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago, back when he still carried a press badge instead of a chauffeur's license, that men like Gregory Hale talked more freely when you let the silence do the work for you. "Quiet," Gregory said. "No greeting, no preamble, the way men like him have always talked to men like Julian. Take the money. Enough to send Sophie to any school she wants until she's 25. Then disappear from Elena Voss's life." He'd done his homework. He knew the daughter's name. That alone should have told Julian exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. Julian looked at the check for a long moment, long enough that Gregory's smile started to widen, thinking maybe this was going to be easier than he'd planned. Then Julian pushed it back across the hood of the car gently, the way you return something that was never really an offer at all. "I turned down bigger checks than this once," Julian said, "because they weren't right. This one isn't either." Gregory's smile went cold and thin. "Then don't be surprised when the board starts asking questions about the relationship between their CEO and her driver." A threat dressed up as a warning. The oldest trick men like Gregory Hale have ever known. By the next morning, the whisper had already made its way through every floor of the building. Julian Kane, it was said, was seducing Elena Voss to engineer some kind of revenge for a story 8 years dead. A few internal emails, carefully, deliberately vague, the kind written to be forwarded, had somehow found their way outside the company. Elena would learn only later that Gregory had set the first one in motion less than an hour after Julian pushed the check back across the hood of that car, moving fast enough to make sure the story took root before anyone could dig up the truth underneath it. By noon, the press office was fielding calls it had no good answers for. Elena's assistant, a normally unflappable young man named Theo, appeared in her doorway twice before lunch, with his phone held out like it was radioactive. 2 reporters, same question both times. They want to know if there's truth to it. Elena said no, told him to say nothing further, and watched him retreat with the particular carefulness of someone who has never seen his boss's hands shake before. She thought about calling Julian directly. Her thumb hovered over his name and her contacts for a full minute before she set the phone face down on her desk, unable to decide whether calling him would help him or hurt him further. Elena wanted to walk into the lobby and deny every word of it herself publicly, in front of cameras if she had to. She'd already drafted the statement in her head on the elevator ride down. Julian stopped her with a single text message before she reached the front doors. If you defend me now, they'll come after you twice as hard. And Sophie gets pulled into it. She stood frozen in the lobby, phone in her hand, watching the message blink at her like a closing door. Some sacrifices announced themselves. This one didn't. It arrived quiet and small, and it was already too late to argue with by the time she understood what it meant. He resigned that same afternoon. No meeting, no drawn-out goodbye, no chance for her to talk him out of it, no scene in a hallway for anyone else to witness. Just a folded note left with building security addressed to her in handwriting she realized with a small and sudden ache she had never once seen before. They had only ever spoken, only ever texted, never once written anything to each other by hand, not until now, when it mattered most. Thank you for trusting me long enough to check the facts yourself. Don't come looking. Sophie doesn't deserve to be dragged into any of this. Julian's decision to disappear wasn't martyrdom, and it wasn't fear of Gregory's threat either. He'd faced worse men than Gregory Hale without blinking. What actually drove him out that door was an older, quieter terror that loving someone in public always seemed to cost the people around him, before it ever cost him. He'd already watched one career die for telling the truth. He wasn't willing to watch a 10-year-old girl lose her stability for the same reason, so he chose the one kind of loss he could still control, instead of the kind he couldn't. Elena read it standing in her own office, the city spread out gray and enormous behind the glass, and felt something in her chest give way that she hadn't known was still holding anything up. She walked to the window and looked down at the parking structure below, at the space where the company car usually sat waiting for her at 6 o'clock every evening. It was empty. Just an outline of oil stains on the concrete where a car used to be, and beyond that, nothing. For the first time in her adult life, Elena understood that losing someone doesn't always come from betrayal. Sometimes it comes from a person loving you enough to walk away before you get hurt on their behalf. She thought about the little apartment above the bakery, the chipped mug by the sink, the math homework spread across the kitchen table like confetti. She thought about a man who had once held the power to destroy her father's company in his hands and had chosen restraint instead, and who had just done the very same thing again, twice in one lifetime, choosing to protect people who would never even know what it cost him. Gregory Hale, meanwhile, was already working the phones, calling in favors from board members who'd known him for 20 years and trusted his version of events out of pure habit. He painted Julian as a predator with a decade-old grudge, and Elena as a woman too clouded by feeling to see it clearly. It was, Elena had to admit, a well-constructed lie. Gregory had always been good at building things that looked sturdy from the outside. He'd had, after all, 8 years of practice, keeping one particular structure standing. Helen Drayton called that evening, her voice tight with the specific fury of a woman who has spent a career watching good reporters get chewed up by people with more money than integrity. "I heard what they're saying about him," she said. "I want you to know I don't believe a word of it, and neither should you." "I don't," Elena said. "Not anymore." She sat alone in her office, long after everyone else had gone home, the note from Julian still open on her desk, and made a decision she should have made the moment she found that memo in the archive 2 nights before. She was done protecting the version of her family's story that let a man like Gregory Hale keep his seat at the table. And done, too, with letting other people pay the price for her family's silence while she stood by and watched. She picked up the phone to call an emergency board meeting, and somewhere across the river in Astoria, a man who thought he'd already given up everything he could give was about to find out that Elena Voss wasn't finished fighting for him yet. 3 days later, Elena stood at the head of an emergency board meeting with a folder in front of her thicker than any quarterly report the room had ever seen. She laid it all out. Her father's handwritten memo, the paper trail of Gregory Hale's stake in a rival firm, the settlement he'd signed and quietly buried 8 years before. Her voice didn't shake, not once, though her hands stayed flat against the table the whole time, as if she needed something solid to hold on to while the truth left her mouth. "My father chose silence to protect this company," Elena said. "Today, for the same reason, I'm choosing the truth." Gregory came out swinging, calling Julian a bitter ex-journalist chasing an old vendetta, calling Elena a woman who'd let herself be manipulated by a man with an axe to grind. His voice climbed louder with every sentence, the way a man's voice climbs when he can feel the room slipping away from him and hasn't yet admitted it to himself. "This is a witch hunt," he said, jabbing a finger at the folder like it might flinch away from him. "Built on the word of a disgraced reporter and a grieving daughter who can't separate business from her own confused feelings." A few directors nodded along out of habit more than conviction, the reflex of people who had spent 2 decades assuming Gregory Hale knew what he was talking about. But the paper trail didn't care what tone anyone used to argue against it, and by the time the vote was called, the room had already turned. 22 years on that board, and it took one folder to end it. Gregory resigned before the vote could even finish being counted, the closest thing to dignity the man had left in him. The following week, Voss Media ran its first self-investigation in company history, published under its own name. No hedging, no spin. The headline was 4 words long: "We investigated ourselves too." Elena wrote the introduction herself, sitting at her kitchen counter at midnight, the same spot where she'd once stared at assignment records trying to prove Julian had planned every second of their meeting. She hadn't slept much that week. Some truths cost you sleep on the way out, the way a fever has to break before the body can rest again. The stock dropped for 2 straight weeks. A few longtime partners quietly pulled back, waiting to see which way the wind would settle before committing to either side of it publicly. Reporters from other outlets, the competitors, the ones who'd once written gleeful headlines about the original scandal 8 years earlier, now wrote careful, almost respectful pieces about a company brave enough to turn the lens on itself. Elena read every one of them, standing at her kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside her. For a while she felt more alone inside her own company than she had in years. The particular loneliness of someone standing by a decision everyone else is still deciding whether to trust. Board members who used to linger in her doorway for small talk now nodded briskly and kept walking. It didn't bother her the way it might have once. She had already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing, and it hadn't been her company's reputation at all. Then Helen Drayton asked to meet her for coffee and told her something that changed the shape of the whole story all over again. "Julian had documents 8 years ago," Helen said, stirring her coffee slowly, choosing her words the way a woman chooses words she's been saving for the right moment. "Documents that could have destroyed your father's personal reputation completely, not just the company's, his publicly, permanently. He never used them. He knew it would hurt people who had nothing to do with any of it, employees, families, you. You were barely a few years into your career back then, still finding your footing, still learning to trust your own judgment. He had the power to burn it all down 8 years ago and chose mercy instead. Twice now, in 2 different lifetimes, he'd made the same choice, and neither time had anyone thanked him for it." Elena found him 2 weeks later, once the worst of the storm had passed. She offered him a position, editorial director of a new, fully independent investigative division within Voss Media. Full authority, a salary that would have made his old newsroom colleagues choke on their coffee. Julian shook his head gently, the way a man declines something he's genuinely grateful for. "If I go back into journalism," he said, "I want to do it under my own name. Not anyone else's empire, not even yours." Instead, he started something small. A newsletter, a weekly podcast, run out of the same Astoria apartment with the chipped mug by the sink. No masthead, no corporate backing, just his name and his questions, and the same careful, patient way of asking them that had cost him so much the first time around. Elena was the very first subscriber. She signed up under her real name, no assistant, no shell account, just Elena Voss, typed plainly into a form on a small independent website, the same way anyone else in the world would do it. The girl who once inherited an empire had just become one man's very first customer. And somewhere in that small, unglamorous gesture, something between them had already begun to change shape entirely. 3 months later, Elena Voss climbed the same narrow staircase above the Astoria bakery right on time at 6:30, holding a bakery box tied with string. Julian opened the door before she could knock, like he'd been listening for her footsteps on the stairs. He looked at her for a second, then at the box, then back at her, and something loosened in his face that hadn't been there the first time she'd stood on this landing. "CEO Voss," he said, "having dinner with a driver." "No." Elena set the box down on the counter and looked at him steadily. "I'm having dinner with the man I spent far too long failing to understand." Sophie came skidding into the kitchen in socked feet, already talking before she'd fully arrived something about a science project involving baking soda and a volcano made from a Pringles can, and whether Elena wanted to see the video of it exploding on the porch last weekend. Elena said yes, of course she did, and meant it more than Sophie could have known. A little girl's volcano video of all things was the moment the whole evening finally felt like it belonged to her. The three of them sat around a kitchen table too small for the amount of laughing that happened over the next hour. Sophie told a long, winding story about her teacher's substitute who couldn't pronounce anyone's last name correctly. Julian peeled an apple in one long, curling ribbon, the way his own grandmother used to do it, he said, back before Elena had ever thought to ask him about anyone he'd loved before her. Elena mostly listened. She was not used to listening without trying to steer a conversation somewhere useful, and she found to her quiet surprise that she didn't miss steering it at all. After Sophie went to bed protesting for exactly as long as 10-year-olds are required to protest, and not 1 minute longer, Elena reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope worn soft at the corners, the paper gone the pale yellow of something that had waited far too long to be opened. "I found this in my father's desk," she said. "After everything. He wrote it in 2018. He never sent it." Inside was a letter from Arthur Voss, addressed, astonishingly, to Julian. In it, her father admitted, in his own careful hand, that the questions Julian had asked all those years ago had been the right ones, fair ones the company should have answered honestly, instead of managing quietly behind closed doors. He wrote that he regretted never having the courage to say so publicly, and that he hoped someday the truth might find its own way out even if he never found the nerve to release it himself. A father's unsent apology finally delivered 8 years late, by the one person in the world who could carry it the rest of the way. Julian read the letter slowly all the way through and then read it again. He didn't say anything for a long time. Elena didn't fill the silence either. Some silences, she had learned this year, are not empty, they're simply full of something too large to rush. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, though he didn't try to hide it, and didn't apologize for it either. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said. "Not selling it, not spinning it, just bringing it." "It felt like the least I could do," Elena said, "for a man who never once tried to burn my family down when he had every reason to." Outside the window, the porch swing on the neighbor's balcony creaked the same way, back and forth, the same small rhythm it had probably kept for years, patient and unhurried, the kind of sound that doesn't demand anything from the people listening to it. Julian reached across the table and set his hand over Elena's, and for once in her life, Elena Voss did not calculate what came next. She simply let it happen. There was no dramatic announcement, no press release, no headline, nothing the world needed to be told. Just two people at a small kitchen table above a bakery in Queens, a sleeping 10-year-old down the hall, and a letter finally delivered to the man who'd waited 8 years to receive it. Quietly, completely, the way the truest kind of peace usually arrives. This story reminds us that the truest inheritance was never the house, the good china, or the name on the building. It's the courage to look back at the parts of our own story we'd rather keep folded in a drawer and choose even late to make them right. Arthur Voss carried his silence for 8 years and never got the chance to set it down himself. If there's a truth you've been sitting on for someone's sake, an apology you owe, a question you never asked before somebody passed, don't wait for a better moment to arrive on its own. This week, buy yourself a plain note card at the pharmacy, sit down at your kitchen table with the coffee still warm, and write out the one thing you've never said out loud to somebody living or somebody gone. You don't even have to mail it. Tuck it in your nightstand drawer the way Arthur did, and let the writing itself be the first honest thing you've done about it in years. And if there's someone in your life you quietly wrote off before you really knew them, a new widower 2 doors down, the fellow who bags your groceries and never says much, Anyone you decided you already understood, invite them to Sunday supper before the month is out. Set one extra plate. Ask a single, real question and let them finish the whole answer without jumping in. Because the people we're quickest to underestimate are so often carrying the deepest wells of kindness. And every one of us, no matter how many birthdays we've had, still has room to be surprised by somebody. Elena Voss learned that lesson at a kitchen table above a bakery in Queens. You might learn it at your own table this Sunday if you leave one more chair open. These narratives were crafted by real individuals who care deeply about truth and fairness. AI helped organize and enhance readability, ensuring the powerful, practical takeaways about kindness, accountability, and human resilience in family life reach and impact audiences worldwide.